The basic structural functional unit of the nervous system is what we call a neuron. And it is through the neurons that our central nervous system is going to be communicated with the internal and then external environment. If it wasn't the neurons, the central nervous system wouldn't be able to communicate with the environment. Good evening to you all. In front of you is none other than TUMNAD. And in today's video, we are going to be majorly focusing on what we call the structural classification of neurons. Okay? Here we have brought three diagrammatic illustrations of different types of neurons by structure. Okay, we want to see how are they going to be different from one another. We have diagram 1, diagram 2, and diagram 3. So now when we see this kind of the neuron, this neuron which is going to be having this axon, having this cell body with multiple dendrites, what we call multiple extensions from the cell body, this kind of neuron structurally is what we call multipolar neuron. Okay, is what we call multipolar neuron. Okay, is what we call multipolar neuron. The fact that it has 3 or plus dendrites. Okay, the fact it has 3 or plus dendrites, we mean in these structures here, it qualifies to be what we call a multipolar neuron. And the multipolar neuron is going to be constituting the bigger percentage of what we call the neurons in the central nervous system. Okay, now this multipolar neuron is going to be having by characteristic is going to be having many dendrites. Okay, they have many dendrites. We have said 3 plus dendrites. Okay, and one of the classic example of what we call the multipolar neuron, we are going to be having what we call the motor. We have what we call the motor neuron. Okay, the motor neuron. Okay, so now the moment you see that kind of a neuron having multiple of the dendrites, having gained one axon, that one is the typical characteristic of what we call a multipolar neuron. So now, where are these kind of neurons located? Okay, so let's have a look and see where we can find these kind of neurons. We can find these kind of neurons in areas that is always having a lot of sensations coming for processing. Okay, take an example like the brain. The brain is always receiving multiple of the information for processing and to generate the motor response. So now one of the most location of these multipolar neurons is going to be the cerebral cortex. Okay, it's going to be the cerebral cortex. And what else? We are going to find also these kind of neurons in what we call the spinal cord. Okay, we can even also find them in what we call the cerebellar cortex. Okay, cerebellar cortex. We can also find them in what we call autonomic ganglia. And of course, when we talk about the autonomic ganglia, we mean both the sympathetic and then the parasympathetic ganglia. So now these are the 4 areas where we're going to be finding these kind of neurons, which we are calling the multipolar neurons. Okay. Another classic example of these neurons, we are going to be having what we call the pyramids. Pyramid cells, and of course we also have what we call the Purkinje. Okay, the Purkinje cells. Okay, now the pyramid cells, they are going to be also in what we call the cerebral cortex, while these Purkinje cells, they are going to be residing in what we call the cerebellum. Okay, so now that is the little information that you need to know about what we call the multipolar neuron. When we come to this number 2, you see this kind of the neuron? This kind of neuron is going to be having a cell body, is having the axon, and is going to be having only one dendrite. Okay? Is having only one dendrite. And when you see that kind of the neuron having only one dendrite, it is a characteristic of a neuron which we call bipolar neuron. Okay? What we call bipolar neuron. Okay? So now these kind of neurons, where do we find them? These kind of neurons are super embedded in what we call the spatial senses, okay? For example, we can find them in what we call in the eyes, and specifically in the eyes, we can find them in what we call the retina, in the retina, and then we can also find them in the roof of the nasal cavity where we have the olfactory epithelium. Okay, we can also find them in what we call olfactory epithelium. Okay, olfactory epithelium, and also these kind of neurons, they can also be found in what we call in the inner ear. Okay, they can also be found in what we call in the inner ear, and generally in the ear. Okay, so these kind of the neurons are super very important. They are characteristic of what we call one dendrite, which is going to be exiting from what we call the cell body. Okay, coming on this kind of the neuron. You see, this kind of neuron is very funny. Okay, this kind of neuron is very, very, very funny. How do we call this kind of the neuron? It doesn't have a distinguishable axon. It has like one axon, but of course, this axon is going to be having made up of two kind of structures. Okay, this kind of the neuron, it is having its kind of the cell body. It is like more on the sides. Okay, it's not like these other neurons. You see, this kind of neuron is very, 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 very unique in its structure. Okay, now this kind of the neuron is what we call pseudounipolar. Okay, is what we call pseudounipolar neuron. Okay, now this neuron is super, super crucial in a way that it constitutes a majority of the sensory neurons that are going to be picking information from the peripherals and feeds it into the central nervous system. Okay, now these ones are going to be more of the sensory extensions that are going to be picking the information from the skin, from the muscles, from the joints, and they feed it into the central nervous system. So now, this kind of extension from towards the area where they're going to be picking the information, or towards the skin, or to the peripherals, this area is what we call the peripheral. Is what we call the peripheral process. Okay, the peripheral process. And again, in this area, which is now going to be close to the central nervous system. Okay, this kind of the structure is what we call the central process. Okay, is what we call the central process. Now, you realize that it is the peripheral process that is going to be picking the sensations and feed it into the central nervous system. Okay, and again, it is now the central process that's going to be picking this information from the whole of this end, it just immediately after this cell body, and feed it into the central nervous system. For that reason, these peripheral processes, they are going to be serving a role of what we call the dendrites. Okay, they are going to be serving a role of what we call the dendrites. So now the peripheral process is like the dendrites of these pseudounipolar neurons. And of course, what happens for the case of the central process? The central process is now we know any extension from the cell body, okay, any extension from the cell body that feeds this information to the central nervous system, it is going to be part of what we call the axon. So the central processes is going to be serving a role of the axon. Okay, from the cell body going to the axon is now going to be the central process, and then from the cell body going up to the sensory receptors is what we call the peripheral processes. Okay, now what is going to be the examples of what we call, or where do we find generally the unipolar or the pseudo-unipolar neurons? The critical example where these neurons are going to be located is what we call the dorsal root ganglia. Okay, the dorsal root ganglia is one of the most important areas where we're going to be finding what we call the pseudo-unipolar neurons. Okay, it's going to be at the back of what we call the cross section. If you cut the cross section of the spinal cord, you're going to be seeing the dorsal root. Okay, just before you enter into the dorsal root here, we have what we call a collection of neuron cell bodies, which we are calling the dorsal root ganglia. Okay, what else? Where else can we locate these kind of the neurons? You know, we have a specific cranial nerve that's going to be having these kind of the neurons. We have what we call cranial nerve number Colony nerve number 5. Okay, colony nerve number 5, and of course you have to be knowing the colony nerve number 5. Colony nerve number 5 is what we call the trigeminal nerve. Okay, so now the sensory nerve fibers for the case of trigeminal nerve, they're going to be having what we call the pseudounipolar neurons. Okay. So now that is now the classical structural classification of these neurons. These kind of the neurons, what we are calling the pseudo-unipolar neurons, they don't have the dendrites, okay? They don't have a unique dendrite which we all know, okay? These kind of the dendrites, they are not true dendrites, okay? So it has the peripheral processes which serves like the dendrites, and then the central processes which acts as the axon, okay? It's such a cool thing. Now, among all these kind of the neurons, which one of them is going to be most common? It's going to be this guy here, okay? This multipolar neuron is going to be constituting the majority of the neurons in the central nervous system, and even also to the general nervous system as a whole. So now let's have a look and see one of these motor neurons by structure, and we see how all the labelings of those parts of that kind of the neuron, okay? This kind of the motor neuron is going to be found being the majority in the whole of the central nervous system. So let's have a diagrammatic illustration of this kind of the motor neuron, and then we see all the parts that's going to be bearing, okay? So now we have to be in mind that the typical structure of the neuron is going to be consisting of the cell body, the dendrite, and then the axons. Those are the three cardinal parts that make up the neuron. Then others are going to be unique depending on the type of the neuron that you're going to be drawing. So let's have a look and now see the classic structure of what we call the motor neuron, okay? So now we are going to be starting with what we call the cell body. Okay, we're going to be starting with what we call the cell body. And of course, we have the cell body is going to be now starting to narrow down. Okay, and then from narrowing it down, you're going to be having now this kind of extension from the cell body. Okay, this kind of extension from the cell body, which we call the axon. And then finally, we shall have what we call the axon terminal. Okay, so I'll have what we call the axon terminal. Okay, the axon terminal. Okay, so now because of this motor neuron is going to be having multiple extensions. Okay, going to be having multiple extensions, which we call the dendrites. Okay, multiple extensions, going to be having what we call multiple extensions. Okay, multiple extensions. Okay, so now this one is going to be now, of course, going to be having a genetic material residing in the nucleus, and of course you're going to be having a layer of this structure here. You're going to be having a layer of these structures here. Very beautiful layer of these structures here. And of course we have to be putting also the cell that is going to be producing this kind of the fatty substance. Have to be now knowing this kind of the fatty substance, or this kind of fatty substance which is going to be wrapping around the axon. Okay, so now this kind of the structure is what we call the motor neuron, and it is how all the structure, all the labelings of this structure, we're going to start now labeling them one by one. Okay, so now when you see these kind of the extensions, okay, that are going to be coming from this kind of this structure, these kind of the extensions that are going to be receiving signals to this cell body, these kind of the extensions are what we call the cell body. Okay, these structures here, these ones are what we call the dendrites. Okay, these ones are what we call the dendrites. And of course, these ones, the whole of this structure here is what we call, this one is what we call the cell, body, or you may find some other beautiful terms as soma. Okay, you may find some other people calling it the soma. Okay, Now, of course, with this structure which is going to be residing in the cell body, we're going to be having a lot of organelles. But this one here is what we call the nucleus. Okay, and we're going to be even having all other kind of the organelles that are going to be residing even in other kind of cells, like the rough endoplasmic reticulum, the what we call even the Golgi apparatus, the ribosomes. All of them are going to be residing inside here. Okay. Now, this kind of the structure of the cell body, as it tries to narrow down before it transition into the axon, this kind of the narrowing that is going to be having highly concentrated voltage gated sodium channel. This area here is what we call the axon, hillock. Okay, is what we call the axon hillock. It is super very important having high levels of what we call voltage gated sodium channels. Okay. Now, this structure that are going to be wrapping around this kind of the neuron, this structure is what we call the myelin, fish. Okay, and this guy is going to be doing a role of what we call insulating the axon that's going to be aiding what we call saltatory conduction or faster movement of electrical impulses. And even besides that, is also going to be aiding in what we call the protection and also part of what we call the nutrition. Okay, so now you see this kind of these black cells, they are going to be producing this fatty substance. How do we call these kind of cells? These cells here, which you are going to be seeing, these ones here, they are what we call Schwann cells. Okay, they are what we call Schwann cells. They are going to be producing this kind of the myelin fish in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, if it was the motor neuron for the case of the central nervous system, it will be now oligodendrocyte. Okay. Now, the whole, you see this gap, you see after the myelin things, we have these gaps. Okay, these gaps, how do we call these gaps? These gaps here, okay, from this point up to this point, you see that gap? It has a critical name. This one is what we call the nodes of Ranvier. Okay, the nodes of Ranvier. It is a super very important, having a lot of different ion channels. Okay, how about this structure here? Okay, this structure here is what we call the axon, the axon terminal. Okay, is what we call the axon terminal. You may find some other people even using what we call the axon bulb. Okay, now, how do we call the whole of this structure here? The whole of this structure here. Okay, up to this point here. The whole of it is what we call the axon. Okay, is what we call the axon. Okay, the whole of this structure here, this tube structure here, is what we call the axon. And of course, we're going to be having what we call the axon terminal, which is like more of the bulbous. Okay, and then of course we're going to be having this kind of the structure which we are calling the cell body, or what we call the soma. And we have said that near the end of the soma, as it's transition into the axon, there's this kind of the narrowing, which we are calling the axon hillock, containing high levels of voltage gated sodium channel. We shall see that one in what we call the functioning of this structure we are calling the axon in the next videos. Okay. Having looked at that, let's have just a very quick recap of what we have just said. We have just said that we have had what we call the structural classification of the neurons. And we said that we have what we call the multipolar neurons, which are going to be having more than 3 dendritic extensions from the cell body, okay? And they are going to be constituting the majority of what we call the neurons, or what we call the multipolar neurons. We have what we call the motor neurons, which is going to be part of what we call the multipolar neuron. We also have what we call the pyramids, which are going to be residing in the cerebral cortex. We also have what we call the Purkinje cells, which are going to be part of the cerebellum. and then other kind of the neurons which are going to be part of the multipolar neurons. Okay, we said that these neurons are going to be residing in what we call the central nervous system, that's of course the brain, then even also the spinal cord. Okay, then we said that we also have what we call the bipolar neurons that are going to be having only one dendritic extension from the cell body, and they're going to be residing mainly in what we call the spatial senses like the eye in the retina, the nose in the respiratory and olfactory epithelium, and also part of the inner ear. And then lastly, we talked about the pseudounipolar neuron, which is going to be having a non-distinguishable kind of the axon, which is going to be having the peripheral process, which is going to be responsible for picking the sensation like from the skin, the muscles, and also from the peripherals, and brings it and connects it into what we call the central processes before it enters into the central nervous system. Okay, and we said that the pseudounipolar neuron is going to be serving most, or going to be most commonly residing in what we call the peripheral nervous system, which is going to be responsible for picking up the sensations to feed it into the central nervous system, with the exception of the sensory sensations coming from the spatial sensor, like from the ear, the nose, and then also the eye, which are going to be having the bipolar kind of the neurons. And we said that they are going to be located, these kind of the pseudounipolar neurons are going to be located in what we call the dorsal root ganglia. Okay. And then we said that we have drawn a structure of what we call the motor neuron, because it's going to be now the majority of the neurons which are going to be located in the body are going to be much of what we call the motor neuron. We have extracted this structure and we have drawn it here. We have said that this structure here is what we call the cell body, or what we call the soma. We have these kind of the extensions which are going to be coming off the cell body, which we are calling the dendrites. Okay. Then we also have what the whole of this tube, which we are calling the axon. But we said that the cell body, as tries to narrow down before it transitions to the axon, this structure having high levels of sodium channels, voltage gated sodium channels, we called it what we call the axon hillock. Okay. Then we said that it has this kind of the fatty substance, which makes it to appear white, that what we are calling the myelin fish, that is going to be doing the role of insulating, and also at the same time doing the role of the protection, and also what we call the nutrition side. This kind of the myelin fish in the peripheral nervous system is going to be produced by these kind of the cells, which we are calling the Schwann cells. Okay. We also said that between these many things, we have this kind of the space which we are calling the nodes of the Renvia. Before we have this kind of the bulbar structure at the terminal, which we are calling the axon terminal. Okay, and then again inside this kind of the cell body, we have this kind of the structure which we are calling the nucleus, which is going to be housing what we call a genetic material, or which we may call the DNA. So now we shall come and extract and look at this structure, and we see how it does its work in great detail. Okay. I'm sure of what I've just talked about, you have picked something. If you have picked something, please, you can support me by liking the video, commenting in the comment section, and make sure you can share the video to the people whom you think is helpful, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you very much for listening to TUMNAD, as always, until we meet next time.